Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host. Thank you for joining today. And before we jump into the story, I have two quick favors to ask you. The first one is a bigger ask, so I'll start with that one. If you enjoy listening to this podcast and you think that you know someone that might also enjoy it, please let them know about it. A bunch of you have reached out and told me that you actually share links to the podcast on your social media, and that's awesome. And that helps the show grow. I really appreciate it. As a matter of fact, I should start a rewards program. I send out a bunch of punch cards, and for every 7th episode share of 10-Minute Murder, you get a free episode. And that's funny because they're all free. That's my first favor. My second one, give me a break on the episode today with the pronunciations. I'm American, obviously. I went to a public school. I took Spanish, so I know a little bit of that. I lived in Germany for a time, so I know a little bit of that. And I struggle with names as a whole, and that's been established on this podcast. I don't know what the connection is with my brain and names. I just can't quite make it all the time. But today is Japan. And if it weren't such a highly requested story, I wouldn't even attempt, because I don't like to get things wrong. So favor number 2, give me a little leeway on the pronunciations. I researched them, I learned how to say them, but that doesn't mean I'm going to, como se dice, get it correct. Hey, if this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, please subscribe wherever you are listening right now. Connect with me on social media, see the visuals that we're talking about here in the podcast, and if you like the episode, leave a rating and review anywhere that is possible. Your positive feedback is appreciated. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to 10-Minute Murder. Now to today's story. The story today starts with a question. What is the most disturbing true crime case you've ever heard of? Every time this question is asked, there's one case that is mentioned nearly every time. The murder of Junko Furuta. You're about to find out why this particular Japanese murder case made it to the mainstream of true crime discussion. In all of the online discussions about murder, Junko is often reduced to just the horrific torture she endured and the final indignity of her body being disposed of in a concrete drum. It's important to acknowledge that she was more than just a murder victim. She was a daughter and a sister, a motivated high school student that was excited for her upcoming graduation trip. Junko was pretty and charismatic, popular at school, and hoped that one day she would become a Japanese idol singer. All of these hopes for the future were brutally cut short by her attackers. The Wikipedia article on Junko's murder describes the case as the worst case of juvenile delinquency in post-war Japan. Despite this, the 4 main perpetrators of the crime received incredibly light sentences, and some of them escaping with only a short stint in juvenile detention. The heaviest sentence received was only 20 years in prison, despite the fact that all of the perpetrators were involved in kidnapping, torturing, sexually assaulting, and finally murdering an innocent high school student. Junko's torture and murder were carried out mostly by 4 teenage accomplices: Hiroshi Miyano, who was the oldest at 18 years old, Joe Ogura and Yasushi Watanabe, who were both 17, and 16-year-old Shinji Minato. It might seem unthinkable that 4 teenage boys would commit such a horrific crime, but the 4 of them weren't exactly new to illegal activity. Acting together, they had previously raped other young women, and they were looking to do it again. It was the 25th of November, 1988, and Junko had finished work for the evening. She set out to cycle home just after 8:30 p.m. when she was spotted by the boys, who were looking for a woman to rob and sexually assault. Her attackers followed a pretty polished plan. Pretending they didn't know each other, one assailant aggressively knocked Junko off of her bike, and the other approached to ask if she was okay, before generously offering to make sure she got home safe. Junko accepted the offer. After sexually assaulting Junko multiple times, Miyano the group's ringleader called his other friends to tell them he had kidnapped the girl. The boys had previously gang raped other women, but they'd always released them after the assault was over. This time, they did not plan on letting Junko go. After the boys rummaged through Junko's backpack, they found her home address written down in a notebook. They told their captive that they knew her family's address and said that if she did not comply with their demands, they would hurt her family. Then, Junko was transported to a house owned by Minato's parents. 2 days after Junko disappeared, her worried parents phoned the police to report their daughter missing. In response, her abductors made Junko make several phone calls to her parents, where she told them that she had left willingly, was visiting friends, and would not be returning home. Unfortunately, this was enough proof for the police investigation to be called off. When Shinji's parents arrived at the house and saw Junko there, it could have been the lifeline she needed, but her abductors had planned for this in advance. They made Junko pretend to be Shinji's girlfriend. However, they didn't have to worry. Shinji's parents were cautious about their son's increasingly aggressive criminal behavior, and eventually it was obvious that neither of his parents would ever intervene. Shinji stopped pretending to be dating Junko, making it obvious that she was an unwilling captive. Neither of his parents did anything to help her. Over the following weeks, Junko's abductors grew increasingly violent towards her. They invited 2 more friends over to gang rape Junko together. When her screams woke up Shinji's parents, once again, neither of them intervened. It was the first time the group of teenagers would invite friends and acquaintances over to assault Junko with them, but it wasn't the last. Over the next 40 days of her captivity, this happened repeatedly with different acquaintances, many of whom were never charged for their crimes against Junko. What Junko endured during those 40 days was horrific beyond words, and it's a miracle that she was able to survive as long as she did. The more desensitized her captors became to her fear and pain, the more they pushed the limits of what they could do to her. She was force-fed alcohol, made to breathe toxic paint thinner, and had multiple objects inserted into her, including a lit match. They poured lighter fluid on her body and set her on fire, creating deep burns which then became infected. At first, her abductors only fed her tiny amounts of food, and then they refused to give her anything but milk to eat or drink. Junko grew weaker and weaker. She was no longer able to walk around, and the swelling around her face from the torture and malnutrition made it impossible to recognize her. As her burns became necrotic and started to smell, her kidnappers were no longer sexually aroused by her, and the sexual assaults stopped. Instead, they kidnapped another young woman to satisfy these urges. It was the 4th of January 1989 when Junko's body finally gave up. Hiroshi Miyano once again covered her body with lighter fluid and set her on fire. Initially, Junko weakly tried to extinguish the flames, but then slipped into unconsciousness. The boys poured hot wax over her face and continued to beat, torture, and humiliate her. They were disgusted by the state of her infected wounds, so they placed plastic bags over their hands so that they could continue the beatings. 2 hours later, Junko Furuta was dead. With a dead body on their hands, the boys were scared of 2 things: being arrested for her kidnapping and murder, and the possibility of Junko's vengeful spirit coming back to get revenge on them for her death. They tried to avoid these issues by disposing of the body in a 210-liter drum, which they filled with concrete. Next to her body, they placed something strange, a videotape of the final episode of Tanbo, which Junko had expressed sadness about not watching. This might seem like maybe a tiny act of kindness, but really it was an attempt to appease Junko's spirit so that she wouldn't haunt them. With Junko's family still believing that she had run away, her abductors and murderers almost got away with the crime. It was only when 2 members of the group were arrested for a different sexual assault that the walls began to close in on them. During his interrogation, the ringleader, Hiroshi Miyano, made a crucial error. He believed that the police somehow had become aware of Junko's murder. Without prompting, he told the extremely puzzled officers where Junko's body was located, inadvertently revealing both that Junko was dead and that he was the one that killed her. The next day, her body was found, and despite being submerged in concrete, fingerprints provided a positive ID. The other 3 accomplices were arrested. Amazingly, DNA evidence in Junko's body also allowed some of the acquaintances who had played a role in her sexual assaults to be identified and arrested for rape. Out of all the indignities that Junko suffered, the one that sticks in the minds of many people is the lack of justice served to her killers. Because the murderers were underage, their identities were suppressed, and they all made the decision to avoid pleading guilty to murder, instead pleading only that they had committed bodily injury resulting in death. A Japanese magazine discovered the identities of the boys and leaked their full names, giving the justification that none of the killers deserved name suppression because of the horrific crime they had committed. The ringleader, Miyano, received the longest sentence, 20 years in prison. Unsurprisingly, several of the perpetrators reoffended, each committing combinations of assault, attempted murder, and fraud. The mother of one of the killers even vandalized Junko's grave, blaming her for ruining the life of her son, even though that same son, Joe Ogura, had repeatedly bragged about assaulting and killing Junko. Shinji Minato's parents, who were aware of Junko's kidnap and abuse, were never charged for their failure to report the crime. Despite the videotape that they buried next to her body, if there is any chance that ghosts are real, nobody should fear being haunted more than the 4 killers of Junko Furuta.